Okay, so in this video, we're going to talk through the timeline that you can expect for the data migration process during your QuickBooks to NetSuite implementation. So when it comes to master records in mapping, I would recommend doing these processes together because they're pretty interrelated, right? The master records is you're taking the reports from QuickBooks and you're manipulating those exports so that you can populate them in the NetSuite import files. And so that's a really easy way, especially for vendors and customers, to keep that QuickBooks name, and then you have the new NetSuite name, and it should be pretty easy to track. One thing that you'll all right, so ideally, right, typically the way you'll load the master records, you'll load those first at the beginning of the project. You'll load all of your existing master records through, let's say, it's December 4th. We export the report today. We've got all of our vendors that we want loaded, that are active out of QuickBooks. We export that today. But we're not going live until, let's say, April 1st, 2024. And so between today and April 1st, we're obviously going to be creating new vendors that get loaded into QuickBooks. And so we need a way to make sure that those vendors also get added into QuickBooks, right? And so typically you'll load your vendors right at the beginning, and then you'll do a second batch kind of right before you go live to make sure you get all those updated vendors brought into NetSuite. Now, there are a couple ways to do this, right? Because you've got all those new vendors that are being created, but you also could potentially have changes to the vendor record that needs to get reflected in NetSuite that might not have gotten put in. So you could either, have the team enter those modifications in NetSuite as you're kind of going. So that's between, the December 4th and the April 30th. That's a pretty tough ask, I think, in my opinion, right, to kind of track that and maintain that. The other option is you can delete all of your vendors in that first batch and then just recreate everything. That is definitely the cleanest approach, I think, but it depends on how many vendors you have and what the level of effort is to clean those master records. And if you're going to take that approach, then I would definitely highly recommend that you clean those vendors and those customers in QuickBooks and not do that in Excel, because otherwise you're going to have to do all that work twice. So, and then as far as the mapping exercise, right, it's nice as you're creating those, the master records to keep track of hey, this is what we called it in QuickBooks, so this is what we're calling it in NetSuite. And if you just do that up front, that'll save you quite a bit of effort as you begin the mapping exercise. So again, I would highly recommend you do those two exercises together. Next, getting into the summary TBs. So the summary TBs can be loaded in 2 batches or potentially even more, depending on how tight your financial close process is. So after you've created all those master records and you've mapped them, right, it's December 4th. We're going live on April 1st, 2024. And so let's say our numbers have been locked through June 2023, and we're confident that those numbers aren't going to change. And so we can really load the data from 1/1/2021 through 6/30/23 today, because those financial statements are locked and they're not going to change. And so there's a couple benefits of doing this work kind of ahead of time, is because one, you kind of get practice at preparing these summary TBs. Second, you're doing the majority of the work when there's no pressure of that go live weekend, right? That's kind of what we really want to try to do, is these practice rounds, is to make that go live weekend as smooth as possible. The other benefits are that, hey, when you're completing your user acceptance testing and your implementation partner is like, hey, do you know how to run an income statement? You can run an income statement and you can see your real data in there in the system, right? That's helpful. The other benefit is you can validate all that historical data ahead of time. Again, that kind of alleviates how much work you need to do the go live weekend. And then finally, right, this will help you plan the actual timing of that second or third batch, because you'll know like this is about how long it took me to do it, right? And obviously if you do it the second or the third time, it's going to be much faster and you'll be much more efficient. So the big takeaway is that you want to load as much of this data ahead of time. Once you know and you're confident that, hey, this data is locked and it won't be changing. So then the third kind of component are these open transactions. So open transactions are only loaded once at the go live weekend because it's the AR balance once you do your final cutover. So there's somewhat limited prep work that you can do that directly benefits that cutover. I still would recommend that you do a trial run in a sandbox or in your production if you don't have a sandbox, where we might say like, hey, we're going to load the open AP as of 6/30/2023 and prepare all the open AP spreadsheets. Again, mostly so that you can see like, hey, this is the level of effort that it's going to take, because that's then going to drive how much time you need to give yourself where you're locked out of QuickBooks and you're loading that data into NetSuite. And so I'll talk about that in a future video about kind of planning your cutover, but that's a really important piece of kind of the practice and why I recommend that you need to do a couple practice rounds in your timeline. In my experience, when I do this, I think of the overall data migration is kind of like the level of effort is a U, right? You're doing quite a bit of work at the beginning, loading those master records, getting them mapped, and loading the first batch of those summary TVs. And then you're kind of in the middle of the project, you're kind of just waiting. And then towards the end, it picks back up, and that last go live weekend, there's quite a bit of effort. Okay, so that's kind of the timeline. In the next video, I'm going to talk about the team and kind of how I would recommend who should be involved in your team and what you can probably expect from your implementation partner. So we'll see you in the next video.